So the first question that we had during Doina's talk is from Denis. So Denis said that Frodo lost much in his quest to destroy the ring. Although his finger has been bitten off his hand, he may be suffering phantom limb syndrome and still feel its presence. If this is the case, he would feel as if his finger was still under the ring's power. At Brooklands Hospital, among other places, Tolkien would have met many people who felt similar sensations after the loss of limbs, and he would have used his knowledge of this while writing of Frodo's post-war agonies. In addition, like Celebrian before him, who had also received a poisoned wound, he may have been raped by orcs in Cirith Ungol during his captivity, evoking in him deep shame and self-loathing, which may have contributed to his choice of not surrendering the ring at Samath Naur. What do you think?
Thank you very much for the question. I never saw it like I never thought about it in this way, which is very interesting for me to talk about like Tolkien having to deal with war and with wounds. I always saw it as a parallel when Sauron lost his finger when he was defeated. So I saw it somehow the parallel, and also maybe at the fact that he was also when he was wearing the ring, as if that was a part that was infected somehow. So like I agree with the comment. But I never reflected so deeply. So that's interesting. So yeah, I agree. It's I just saw it mostly as a parallel and mostly maybe as something that he wanted to get rid of somehow, even if it was still a wound that he had to remember that stayed with him.
Excellent. Thank you, Doina. If anyone else has any thoughts, please do jump in, get involved, and if not, I will read out another question. Okay, so I have one here from Louise from Amelia who asks, do orcs die naturally or are they immortal just like elves? Is there any information about that? That's fascinating. I think orcs are such a conundrum, and I know that Tolkien also considered this a huge conundrum. So please do let
Yeah,
us know your thoughts.
thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a great one. It depends on which origin story you take, I guess. There's one reference I found where I think in one of the origin stories, Tolkien said that orcs had a lesser lifespan even than men. So that I think that was connected to the more created ones or the more constructed ones. I'm not sure. So if anyone knows, feel free to jump on in. Um, I think my own personal sort of suspicion is that by the breaking down and the disruption of their original personhood, whether they were orcs or elves, the relationship in the Hroa and Fëa has changed somehow, and so they're still incarnate beings. They still have a Fëa of some kind. So yeah, if they were elves, maybe that Fëa will go to the halls of Mandos. Who knows? There might be a whole special wing for them. I kind of think that'd be great. That wouldn't it be rewarding in some ways if when some of the elves get there, they're like, oh, what are you guys doing here? Well, we were once elves too, you know. So that's just a bit crazy, but. Whereas if they were made from men, they would certainly be mortal and they wouldn't reappear. Their fail would not reappear. Um, then there's also the tack that they can be almost made bestial, and that could be almost the Fëa could almost be driven out beforehand. There are multiple ways of interpreting, I guess. So there's no one really easy answer. The only other thing I would say is that more of them are likely to be killed, like Rory was just saying about the genocide, because more orcs are killed, more orcs are damaged, more orcs are wiped out. Fewer of them get the opportunity to die of natural causes. So maybe they don't often have to ask that question. Thank you. I hope that answers it in some way.
Absolutely, that is a really good point. Okay, so we've had one come in from Christine for Rory. Does the difference between the effect of elf and orc bodies reflect the relative amount of Morgoth principle in their bodies?
I knew Chris would come with a really good one. Um, yeah, so the evil of the orcs is a really interesting one because it is fundamentally Morgoth's crime. It is Morgoth's evil. but it's also inherited. Like this isn't like a one and done like generational trauma. This is something that is passed on with, you know, the orcs reproducing in the manner of men. So I think this is one of those like metaphysical corners that Tolkien paints himself into and is trying desperately to get out of in Myths Transformed. Because on the one hand, yeah, they do have a lot of Morgoth in them, but they also do have free will. They have free choice. We see that in The Lord of the Rings a lot. They are making decisions, good, bad, interesting, personally motivated, fearful. We end up kind of between these two things. So actually the orcs are kind of weirdly human in the way that Tolkien presents them in his work. So I genuinely don't know between the two, but I think the subject of like the nature of the corruption of orcs is something that I think needs a lot more research. It'll probably get a little bit more time in the proceedings. It may have had more time this week if I hadn't been laid up all week ill until like yesterday. So, you know, there's quite a lot of untangling around all of this. Um, and part of the reason I focused away from kind of the Morgoth principle was because I was trying to focus specifically on the physicality. Now, the way Tolkien writes it, you can't actually separate those two things entirely anyway, but in the interests of time and focus, it is still an underexplored point that I want to that I do want to get back to at some point.
Thank you so much, Rory, and it's all the more reason for us to be excited about the proceedings when they do follow for this seminar. So I have one that I actually think that I'll just kind of open up to everyone. Um, from Pete Clark, he asks, do you have any reflections on links between or contrasts between healing of people, their bodies or spirits, and the healing of landscape in Tolkien? So please, if any of our speakers have thoughts, please do share them. And everyone's too polite to be the first one to to jump in.
And I could start on this one. I think the first example I think of where, you know, when we get that question is the scouring of the Shire and the fact that the physical and mental healing of land and people is very much intertwined. Um, but I think not everyone gets healing in Middle Earth, right? Orcs get genocide. That's it. That there is no nicer, softer way to describe what happens to them. Charles Mills actually says that, you know, we should that the Lord of the Rings should be compulsory reading on genocide studies because it is a really good example of how you justify one. So yikes. But I feel like a lot of it is about existing relationships with land and how those are expressed. Orcs destroy land in life and they destroy land in death, or they keep land destroyed in death. Elves are lovely and idealistic about how they relate to nature, and so they heal nature. Hobbits are active workers in healing the Shire, and so the Shire is actively healed. I feel like there's a lot in there about different people's approaches to what healing is even possible. Um, and yeah, I see Karen in the chat talking about orc healing. They are very very right about this because yeah, orcs deserve healing, and this is part of the glory of the Free Orcs AU that actually orcs do get healing. They do get nice things. And I think the way Tolkien writes it is quite a straight-laced starting point, but there is room to decide that we want to explore the possibilities because the wonderful thing about like the catch-all frame narrative idea is that there's narrative bias. So if you think that what this sounds like is Pengalov being not particularly nice to people, then fine. Tell your own story, ditch Pengalov, and see what happens. And that's part of the power of the transformative angle I was talking about, is that actually once we start asking these questions, asking who gets healing, who is allowed to take part in healing, who just heals naturally by being, like once you start asking those questions, and then you can start saying, actually, do we like this? Do we want it? Is this the only way we want to see it? And as Chris says, the fact that Tolkien knew he messed up is a good start. That's always been one of my favorite things about him as an author, that he had the capacity to change his mind. It's also the single most frustrating thing when you're trying to read unfinished tales, but that's an entire other conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rory. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to add to that about, any links between healing of bodies and spirits and healing of landscapes?
We do get a little bit of a snippet of the healed Adar at the end of Rings of Power, and thanks to Nenya. And that raises a whole load of questions. And the fact that it doesn't last and that he gives it back of his own volition, I wish I had time to dig into that, and it will probably go on the proceedings. That he's now accepted who he is. He's almost like he's finally dealt with all those traumas that have caused him to perpetuate and replicate it, and leading to all that corruption. And then all of a sudden it's like, actually no, this is, I can be a healthy Uruk. I don't have to be a once was elf. I'm now a healthy Uruk. And you just get that tiny little bit and he gets killed. And it's really, I find it almost frustrating that because of the narrative arc has the end game is set, there's only so much that can be teased within the narrative frame of Rings of Power. So I'm really glad, Rory, you mentioned the fanfic archives and things like that, where there's so much more scope for exploring outside the shape. And I'm kind of frustrated by I'm almost certain they're going to go back to like the old style orcs gradually in the next season of Rings of Power. That'll be interesting to see how quickly they do, because it will be lovely to see what a healthy orc would look like. What would they look like? Would they still be afraid of the sunlight? Could they be almost like another kind of dwarves? Would they want to live underground or in caves? Would they still not like water but still be able to drink it? How does that affect their ongoing relationship?
So we actually have a question which kind of follows on really nicely from that, from Karen in the chat. And it's, why is it assumed that Arda's terraforming is towards inhospitable? Is it not more hospitable for the orcs? So thinking about Mordor being shrouded and there not being any sunshine. And they ask, is this not a white colonialist framing of what is hospitable or inhospitable?
Yeah, I must admit, looking at the ecopoiesis, reverse ecopoiesis, that's very much from whoever's perspective you're looking. So from Ada's perspective, absolutely it's ecopoiesis. For the Southlanders, it isn't. But what did interest me is the fact that because Adar's repurposing a plan he didn't make in the narrative of Rings of Power, he's adopting he's adopting the corruption that comes with that. Like Rory said, the Melkor ingredient that is there, inherited whether you like it or not. And then you have to deal with it. So yeah, my intention was not to let it appear that way. So I apologize if that came out that way. I think that it would be very interesting to see what a landscape would look like where they could coexist. What would a not so corrupted Mordor look like? What genuinely healthy and flourishing home could the Uruks have? And that's continuing the same question. So yeah, trying to reframe it and think through from those angles will be fun.
Yeah, and I would love to add to that, because of the blatant disability coding of the orcs. Again, what does a healthy orc look like? Can healthy orcs still be disabled? And
Yeah,
speaking as a
yeah,
disabled person, I'm like,
yeah.
I don't think I'm an orc, but
Well, healthiness is Hroa
my
and
body
Freya
does
together.
suck.
Yeah,
Sorry, what
Hroa
was
and
that?
Freya together though. So if you're Freya and Hroa is healthy according to what's health for you, and then if your Freya is also healthy, those two things will work in harmony. So I guess it's a question of what that looks like for orc harmony. Hey, And I don't think
Yeah.
it precludes disability at all, no. Or other ability.
Yeah. Yeah, it's disentangling that physical
Mm,
and spiritual corruption, because Tolkien's working with a quite medieval idea that,
yeah.
the twistedness of the inside is expressed on the outside.
Mm,
And disability wise, everyone's like, not a humongous fan of that, thank you very much. But part of disentangling that and saying, actually, maybe there's a completely different way of looking at it, actually just
mm,
all it does is make more space for more people in Middle Earth,
yeah.
and I don't see how that can be a bad thing.
The converse of that is, of course, recognizing the ones who look beautiful and don't always act beautiful, like certain orcs. Feanor, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So I have one that came in, and again, this follows on quite nicely for Doina from Alan. So he says, you rightly discussed how injury and disability is not portrayed as shameful or a moral failing by Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. However, I don't think the same can be said about Brandir, Lamefoot in The Children of Húrin, which I think does fall into some of the old corrupted inside and out tropes. Do you think there are thematic reasons for that, or are we just seeing how Tolkien's own views evolved over time?
So somebody in the group chat was saying something funny, which is like depending what time of the day you're asking Tolkien about it, I guess. So I feel that I'm gonna go with this idea. At the same time, I'm sorry, I read Children of Hurin like a long time ago, so maybe I don't remember everything. So I do apologize, and I'm inviting Rory and Louis to actually back me up on that if they know more. But I feel that maybe I see them as different ideas and different work somehow, because in one maybe he was more going with the myth and with that thing of like bad, good, evil, or something like that. Meanwhile, Lord of the Rings is more like um a realisms. I don't have the words what I wanted to say. Moral realism. So yeah, so I just feel that, as a lot of people were discussing in the chat, like Tolkien evolved a lot and changed his mind and went back and didn't continue his work. So I feel that it's mostly about that. But if somebody doesn't agree, please go on.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think continuing in the highest traditions of Tolkien and changing our minds is the kind of overriding approach that gives the most. Doesn't mean anyone has to do it, but I think it's much more fun, so I think you should take it.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we have another one. This one came in for Rory, but again, it's open to absolutely everyone if you have any thoughts you'd like to add. This is from Mark Richards, who asks, how about the effect of the resting places of men? I'm thinking of the barrows of lords of men, such as the Barrow Downs, and the barrows of the kings of Rohan, the latter of which are overgrown with Symbolmuna.
Yeah, so I men occupy their own place in the great chain of being that Charles Mills elaborates. So he talks about the medieval idea of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the and men are squarely in the middle of that hierarchy. So I kind of wanted to take the two extreme ends of it, but I do think that there's some interesting stuff about men in there too. Um, Time meant, obviously, we're not going to go into the whole thing in the talk. But somebody mentioned Tol Morwen in in the chat, and I think the examples I've seen people talk about with that, mainly Amy Arendt Radwege, and Dormals Thummer, both talking about death. So the first one is a book called The Sweet and the Bitter, and the Dormals Thummer's article is in the recent issue of General Tolkien Research about Tolkien and psychology. And they both talk about this very metaphysical idea, this like medieval idea of the ars moriendi, or the, the art of dying well. The physicalities of men's graves don't seem to come up in quite the same way. Like the only one of the very few times, if not the only time I can think of, that we have a mass grave of men where we also see the effect of the ecology is the dead marshes. And I don't know what I think about the effect of men's bodies on that. And yeah, as Mark just said in the chat, death is defined as the gift of men. So it feels like it's a natural sort of stable middle point for everything. Whereas elves don't die unless they really, really do, and orcs aren't really there to do anything but die. So I think the physicalities of men's graves are, I don't think they appear in so much detail, which doesn't mean it's not a question worth asking. I think we just have quite a lot less text to work with. And I don't know, maybe mass graves of men would have struck a little too close to home for Tolkien, given his experiences in the First World War, because that is exactly what quite large areas of France and Belgium are at this point, because of that event. And I think maybe Tolkien found more interest in what happens when people who aren't supposed to die, and what happens when evil things die. I wonder if the deaths of men would just kind of on the normal side when it comes to the physicality. I know the survival of Tol Morwen, and the hauntings of the Barrow Downs, the paths of the dead, that kind of thing. Those are all largely spiritual, metaphysical, ghostly things, which Tolkien does plenty of. Yeah. Yeah. So burial rituals of Rohan and Gondor. Um. Oh, who was it I was reading about this? I think it might have been in The Sweet and the Bitter, where essentially they demonstrate very different societal attitudes to death, where Gondor, like Numenor before it, is trying to like keep it at arm's length and behind stone, and we don't really want to think about that if we can help it. And Rohan just being like, yeah, sure, we walk past the graves on the way in because that's how it goes. But it is, those things are very much in relation to the workings of everyday life. Like Rathinen is a purpose-built thing so that death can be kept in its place in society. Likewise, the mounds of the Rohirrim. And they demonstrate two different responses to the same question, which is, men die, what are we going to do about it? What are we as groups going to do about it? Because it's natural, because it's normal. And sorry, Numenor, it is normal. Get over yourselves. Don't do what you're about to do, for God's sake, because otherwise we end up with a round world and time zones. So
And they
yeah,
caused a lot of issues with this seminar.
always
Always.
it's a whole it is a whole thing. But I think that's part of why talking about death and men kind of there's a philosophical angle. I mean, you got Findor, the Athrobeth, the whole like, but men die. Is that not a bad thing? Is that not a good thing? I don't know. And then men thinking it's not a good thing. See again, Numenor. Then all this kind of stuff. But it's very, very much kind of ingrained in what they are thinking and how they work as societies, how they acknowledge or don't acknowledge death. So I think that that's a very kind of long roundabout way of saying that death is normal enough to men that nature doesn't really need to have an opinion, because death itself is natural. where orcs are not natural, but they're still better off dead, and elves are very natural and it is not natural for them to die. So what is the earth going to do when it's got them in it? So I think men kind of occupy this interesting kind of philosophical point between the two, which doesn't quite fall into the physical entanglement that I'm talking about, but is also superbly interesting. And I really need to read The Sweet and the Bitter from cover to cover rather than just grabbing out random references for a talk.
Amazing. That's one I'll have to put on my list to be read, which is ever growing. Mark also made a little comment in the chat, which got me thinking. He was talking about the Barrow Downs being haunted, and then the mounds of the Rohirrim having all these, beautiful flowers. And on a very like basic level, I'm thinking about the response of the earth with Shadowfax and the fell beast, kind of extending it beyond men to animals, and how where the fell beast is dies and is burned, the earth remains scorched and horrible, but where Shadowfax is buried, the grass is tall and lush. I just think, it just occurred to me that there is that little parallel, that it goes beyond men and elves to even the animals too. Um, we do have one last question that's come in. This one is from Karen, and it's for Doina. Karen asks, has Doina considered Chapman's empire of normativity in relation to her paper? The idea of disability being invented as an arm of capitalism and replacing the pre-industrial framing of difference feels very relevant. So if you have any thoughts on that, Doina, or any of our other speakers.
I don't know. I read the questions in the chat earlier. I don't know, but I noted it on my notebook to read about it because I'm very interested in that. Thank you very much, but I don't know that, so
Oh,
I'm
that's
gonna not say anything wrong.
No, that's absolutely fine. And one of the things these seminars are so great for is that you
Yeah.
have your notebook and you're constantly saying, oh, I have to read that
Yeah.
paper or that book, and learn a bit more about that. That's absolutely fine. If anyone else, I think this is our last question. So if anyone else has any thoughts on that, if they've read Chapman's Empire of Normativity, and they want to contribute anything, great. That would be lovely.
So I'm going to start with a question for you, Burkay, from Stephen. What do you make of Gimli's relationship with cruel Carathras?
Well, that's a nice question, because Caradras is another, let's say, environment with an agency. Interestingly, it's an environment, non-human environment, but it does not have apparently consciousness or sentience. But interesting enough, it has or seems to have some kind of agency. And in that moment, Gimli understands, perhaps, or I don't know if he was aware of this before that moment, but he comes to understand that Caradras um, is behaving antagonistic toward them. That's an interesting understanding of him. Uh, well, they're, I mean, because he says Caradras did not forgive us, and it ties into Legolas's prejudice in his remark saying to Gimli that dwarves can mar more than they can make. So perhaps this kind of prejudice or opinion from the elves has a base, and it comes from stories like that, that dwarves in the past were or they could actually mar some of the natural habitats and do some or harm these places. But in the end, after Gimli's eloquent words or his intense praise of the glittering caves, we see that it's not always like that. So they might have marred Moria before, Khazad-dûm, but it doesn't mean that this is what dwarves always do. They can change, or even if they don't change, they're not always harmful. We see that in Gimli's fascination with the glittering caves. So uh, some of the dwarfs, or inherently, they are able to appreciate nature. And if we remember back in Moria, when Gimli chants a song from Dwarven culture, it talks about the first age, and some parts of the song have praise of nature, moon, um, green forests. So we kind of see that in dwarven history, there are moments that we see that they were able to appreciate nature. So it's not like they are unable to appreciate nature. So I guess Legolas's opinion is partly true but partly wrong.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. I am also constantly thinking about when characters say something that they might just be wrong. Han, the next question is for you from Layla. Do you think the three elven rings protected Frodo from the Nazgul's powers? And if so, would that weaken the Nazgul's power when Gandalf was with the Fellowship versus when he wasn't?
Thank you for the question. And Leila, and for your first question, yes, to some extent, of course, yes, because the elven power, elven rings, they are positive and they are against the one ring's power, the Sauron's power. So of course, they protected Frodo from the Nazgul's powers, but not absolutely. For example, Galadriel gave Frodo the file, and the file is not honest and it's not at work every time. So it's just the protective power, but we cannot think it's the it's the almighty power in this way. And when Gandalf was with the Fellowship, I won't say the Nazgul's powers were weakened, but because my research here is about the smell of Nazgul, so here I said the Nazgul's smell or olfactory ability was disrupted by the elven power or the other supernatural supernatural forces to just weaken and or the sensory noises in this sense. Yeah. And the next question I saw it from the platform. It's because the Nazgul has to return to Mordor after their defeat. And I want to say, to some extent, yes. Because they need to take new strategies to catch the ring bearer after their defeat. So that can be part of the cause, but it's not in my researches how to say the border. So I don't know if I answered the question. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you, Han. That was a great answer. I had especially loved your point in your presentation about how different smells and physical and supernatural things like complicated their heightened sense of ability. I'm going to bounce back and forth. So, Berkay, another question for you from Jennifer, who first says, thank you for expanding her world, my world, probably all of our worlds with your paper. And her question is, do you have any insights into the importance of the personification of nature in the form of Fangorn, Ents, Caradhras, stone trolls, with our understanding of the value of a shared joy in the environment, breaking down prejudice and stereotypes?
Okay, thank you for this question. First of all, please excuse my long pauses of thinking. Sometimes I think for a long time. It also happens in my own language. Um, I think those kinds of personifications of nature and elements or beings in nature is really important and unique in Tolkien. Because not only the human non-human dichotomy also includes elves, dwarves, and other things into the human category, because in that dichotomy there is a human and a non-human. But in the non-human category, we see different beings with their own sentience or conscience. That's really intriguing, because they're not like the characters in some of the earlier fantasy books, where they are just there for diversity or for something on display, but they have a real role, and sometimes their philosophies and ideas and opinions could be more striking than other characters. So I think they are pretty unique and important. So they are having agency like Caradhras, the mountain, and they are having their own voice and role. I think is really important, because normally in our world we sometimes are prejudiced, but most of the times there's a complete ignorance of the agency of nature. Even though we don't think that they have consciousness, but we definitely know that they are sentient beings, but some of them definitely have consciousness, but people ignore this fact. So this is a significant aspect of the book, because readers come to feel this sympathy, a strong sympathy for these characters or these places, these environments. And it's also a starting point when you start feeling sympathy towards something in literature or in art. Then it translates into your own life, and we generally see that it starts like this, just like Legolas and Gimli's relationship start on a personal level. Then this translates into their relationship with their respective races, and it also includes their relationships to their respective embodied habitats. When at that point you start to embrace everything.
Yeah, excellent point. Your comments about sympathy, I think, are especially poignant these days. And I'm always curious what Tolkien would have thought about how much research came after his time about the consciousness of things that we don't think of as sentient beings.
By
Han,
the
the
way,
next.
Claire, somebody asked me a question about the book that I wrote in. The book is in Turkish. Actually, it's in Turkish language. It's the first academic book in Turkish language about Tolkien, and that's why it's kind of important and unique, I think. I'm going to write in the chat box the link for it.
Yes, please.
The official link for it, but they can, I think, find the book on Amazon if they speak Turkish or if they're interested in something new.
Yes, definitely. We'll brainstorm some translation strategies, maybe. I am curious about the book. Han, I have a question from you, from Thomas Honegger. So Thomas asks, in The Hobbit, when Bilbo approaches Rivendell, he says that it smells like elves. Does this somehow fit into your fine argument about the Nazgul? And I will add something to Thomas's question when you're done answering how it fits into your argument, is what do you think that smell is? Like, what smells like elves?
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Claire, for your questions. And firstly, I will answer Thomas's question. And I thank you, Thomas, for your comment, actually, because you remind me of the smell of elves. So I was just wondering, actually, it can strengthen my argument after the Rivendell, because let's imagine if Nazgul can also smell the elves like Bilbo. So when they encounter hobbits with elves or the places of elves, they will think, oh my goodness, it's our powerful enemy. So maybe it's time for us to go back to Mordor to think another way to get our ring or something else. So I think it's really a good point to inspire me to add something to my Nazgul's smell. And where's the question? Sorry. Yes. And for the for the smell of elves, actually, I thought about this question before myself, but I couldn't imagine. To be honest, it's really hard to reply, and I think it's the a beautiful smell. It's hard to describe, but it must be really pleasant, and it can make you peaceful. And when you smell it, you will feel, oh, I'm safe, or just I'm peaceful, and yeah, in this way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Han. If anyone else has ideas for how elves smell, you can put that in the chat, and we will steal your answers. Another question for you, Briquet, from Victoria. She asks, in case you're familiar with Morton's theory on hyperobjects, which, given the sources for your paper, I'm sure you are, do you think that Sauron and his evilness could be considered a hyperobject which permeates Middle Earth? And if you deviate at all into the First Age, and have any thoughts about how Tolkien describes the Melkor ingredient in the matter of Arda, I would love to hear about that too. But that's my addendum for you.
Yeah, I think Morton's concept of hyperobject really fits in this discussion, because the hyperobject, according to Morton, is an entity that we don't necessarily see in physical form, but it's like a phenomenon. It's massively distributed, which is like universal or international, but we don't see it, such as global warming is included one of these things, or climate change could be a hyperobject, things that we don't see, so people tend to ignore because you don't see its you see its effects, but you don't see this yourself in your life. So the Sauron's effect and his evilness can be started with the discussion of Melkor ingredient that Tolkien mentions in Morgoth's Ring at the end of the book in his notes. So there in Arda, there is the Melkor ingredient that is dispersed throughout Arda, and that is the representation of evil. Um, and it's always there. And once it's there, you cannot destroy it completely, but you can stable, like you can always constantly build resistance toward it, and always try to resist and fight back. And it's a never-ending fight or process, I believe. So after Melkor is defeated, this is going on with Sauron, but even after Sauron is defeated, this Melkor effect is always present in Arda, which is like the evil that is always present. Even though you just destroy or win against one evil entity or person or actor, the evil does not go away. There will always be evil in the world. So this hyperobject, as an hyperobject, evil, their evil, will always be present. So building constant resistance toward evil is necessary.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. Bouncing back to you, Han. Dennis asks if the priority of smell by the Nazgul relates to the fact that they are no longer fully present, fully physically present, and that they no longer have complete sensory access. And I also have kind of like a follow-up question to this one as well, because during your presentation, I was thinking that given that their sight is very much through the shadow world, and and then smell seems much more tied to the physical world. And so I was curious too about your thoughts about how, as overall everything exists so liminally, but do you think different senses are closer for them to the shadow world or closer to the physical world, and how those different dynamics contribute to their overall sensory experience, if that makes sense?
Sorry, Claire, I want to make your question clear. You want to ask about the overall sensory of Nazgul, or you mean their sensory experience, which is stronger to the physical world, which is stronger to the shadow world, or
Yeah, do you think their sense of smell ties them more clearly to the physical world? And per
okay, I get
Dennis's
you.
question, that they're less embodied, but it seems to tie more to the physical world, where maybe something like sight seems to be more affected by the shadow world, as they kind of exist in the middle.
A very tricky question, yeah.
And I'm sorry, I should have asked an easier question.
Thank you for your question. It's a very good question, but I need time to think about it, and I will answer Dennis first. And thank you, Dennis, for sharing the quote from the Nature of Middle Earth. That's very helpful. And I think your question, I will give you a yes, because that's true, because the Nazgul, after they were corrupted, and their physical appearance became more and more transparent. So the other senses, like sight, like the hearing, like touch, and they cannot be touched, and they cannot be seen, except for their, how to say, their cloaks and their horses. And I will say yes, because the and I want to because I can't say a lot about this question, but I can recommend you to read William's work, because William's work, I think, can give you a more profound answer to this question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Han. That's great. Burkay, going back to you, a question from Mark. So at the end of their lives, so to speak, Legolas and Gimli venture to an environment that will be totally new to both of them, Valinor and Aman. How do you think that will affect their place in the mesh and like their engagement between embodiment and the environment?
Yeah, that's a nice question that I didn't think of before. Uh, it's nice because throughout his journey, Legolas has progressively become more and more adapted in his mind and also in his body to see his entanglement with different ecologies. And it starts with Fangorn, it starts with Legolas, and also before that, it starts with finding his peril in Lothlorien when he gets exposed to Galadriel and the environment in Lothlorien for the first time, because he also terms it as peril. And he also has found there the peril of light and joy. So these kinds of experiences have prepared him mentally for his next further visit to Valinor in the future, where he will see a totally new entanglement with a different kind of environment. And it's also going to be a new thing for Legolas, because Legolas so far has only heard about Valinor and the Blessed Realm through their songs or other people's verbal verbal culture, let's say. So it's going to also to be a completely new thing for him, and their experiences of finding their own entanglement or their own interconnectedness with different environments, and that is the mesh, also have prepared them for this new journey where they're going to find a completely new thing.
Yeah, thank you. I wish Tolkien had written just a little bit about that, and then weid have some text to
That leaves
explore.
room for fan fiction.
Yes, I'm sure there are some great fanfics. I know there are some great fanfics about that. Han, the next question is for you about the Nazgul's fear of water, which is perhaps rooted in folklore, but metaphysics too. And so the question is that perhaps the flow of water, pure and ever moving, can disorient the Nazgul, rendering them blinder to the world of the living and dulling their sense of smell. In this way, could water symbolize the boundary between corruption and life, cleansing away the very senses that tether them to their dark existence? What do you think of that idea?
Thank you for the question. And it's the actually I know a little about the fear of water by creatures from the other world, and but I don't know more than that. I need to read more more books about it, but that's very good questions. And I think water is a very important it's a very important substance, and it's flowing, and the its quality and its power can, I think it can be the hinder of Nazgul's action. But if it's really about smell, I'm not sure now. So I think it's a open question and to the future research. And also, Claire, I was thinking about your question just now. I I showed in my presentation that that's in between, and the left and the right is equal to equal. But to be honest, I think the smell, this sense, drags Nazgul closer to our physical world, because they were men. They wanted to get the power, get the they had a desire for power, for maybe immorality or everything. And then they were corrupted by the One Ring, and then they didn't have their physical appearance. So I remembered that in the text, Nazgul, Aragorn said, Nazgul hates the hates the living, or just like they all the time desire blood of the living, the blood of the living creatures. So this kind of smell drags them more to the physical world, although they could not be in the physical world completely. So that's their situation. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Han. I love that idea that they're so tied to it in such a concrete way and yet still can't be a part of it. So I think we have time for one more question. So this question is for both of you from Alison. What are your thoughts of the orcs and Amazons' rings of power? So I'm going to assume maybe you have seen it, yearning for a homeland of their own. Given that their organic bodies are destroyed, do you believe there's a chance for inorganic bodies to establish a natural connection with their habitats?
Maybe I can I can ask a further question about this. So the dichotomy here, the organic bodies and inorganic bodies. Um, do we mean by it the organic bodies were the original bodies when they were elves, and inorganic bodies are the orc bodies that there are right now? Is it what is meant by this? If it's that, I don't think uh, the existing bodies of the orcs are inorganic. They're still organic. They're kind of part of nature, even though they are corrupted. Their original bodies were okay organic, but the new bodies are something new. Even though they're corrupted, I think they're still organic. But their chances of finding a connection with nature, I'm not really sure, because when they were pure, when they were created for the first time, their first bodies as elves or men in some of Tolkien's writings, he's also discussing whether they were men or elves. They were able to find connection with nature, but right now, since they are corrupted, I think Tolkien's idea is that they lost their ability to connect with the nature that the Valar or through Valar Eri created in the world. Maybe with the corrupted nature, they can connect. It's still a question. I think they can only connect with nature as a thing of function, perhaps, but I don't think they can find a connection. But maybe they can. Like, this is an interesting possibility to discuss.
Yeah, we'll see what Rings of Power does in future seasons. Our first question from Laylee is for James. Laylee says, thank you for your paper. She likes your interpretation of the clear weather upon Autru and Atrun's death. And she would like to propose another interpretation. By taking the potion, Atrun claims mastery over his wife's body through deceit. And we could see the fair weather as fakery fair under Atru's influence. Once Atru pays for his transgression in deceit, nature celebrates the end of its and Atrun's enthrallment. Does that match your interpretation? Differ?
So, first of all, thanks a lot for that question. Definitely, I really like that interpretation. You know, the clear weather at the end of the Lay of a Trodden Throne isn't just a sign of peace or forgiveness. The fair weather at their deaths could just as easily, as you remarked, be read almost as a mockery, a deceptive calm that mirrors Otro's own deceit. And as you point out, by taking the potion, he claims mastery over Itron's body and fate ultimately, so disguising control as love to a certain extent. And I do agree that yes, the fair weather at the end might then reflect that false harmony. I mean, there is betrayal, after all, on Otro's part for concealing the use of the potion, despite it emerging out of good intentions in a desperate situation. But then again, is Otro's actions perhaps a selfish act to preserve his lineage, given that he didn't have any children? So perhaps he's not entirely the good guy he appears to be at first glance. So, and I think that's the beauty of Tolkien's work. Ultimately, it always leaves this space for this kind of layered reading, despite it being a very short work. So what seems like a simple moral ending can suddenly shift underneath your feet, and it opens up new meanings about power and deceit, and ultimately the natural order. And I don't think each interpretation cancels the others one out. It feeds into and enriches the world he's built, especially within these very short narratives. So thanks again for the question.
Yeah, great answer, James. Our next question is for Aaron. Aaron Christopher asks, can we attribute the lack of information and even apathy about the origins of the Pukel men that line the road to Dunharrow to this conflict? It seems like the Dunlendines were more bitter. Can you speculate why the Erlingas did not destroy or replace them?
That's interesting. Yeah. So it is something I thought about quite a bit, because what I think is really interesting there is that the Rohirrim are living in a landscape that is full of bits and pieces that other cultures built there. And it's different from a lot of the other spaces that we see, I think, in Lord of the Rings. So there's several monuments constructed by the Númenóreans/Gondorians, but then we do also have, the Pukelmen as this kind of monument from even before the Númenóreans. And it is interesting because in other respects, the Rohirrim often are a bit superstitious about things. But they do seem almost to kind of ignore the Pukelmen. I think one of the things that I struggled with a little bit there was I was looking into the Men of the White Mountains, who of course become the dead of the Paths of the Dead, right? When they fail to fulfill their oath to Isildur and get cursed. Because the interesting thing we see is that the Dunlendings are related to the folk of Haleth, apparently. The folk of Haleth, back in the First Age, migrate into Beleriand, and they migrate into Beleriand with some of the Druidine as like friends. So it's not, there is precedent, right, for people of this kin to be friends with the Druidine. And I wondered if the the men of the White Mountains were in that group. But it seems from available evidence that is left to us from Tolkien that that was actually not the case. So that for me, at least, the meaning of the Peukelman is very difficult to parse. But I wonder, because in part, I think we do see that from Mary's recollection, or from Mary's perspective, the statues of the Peukelmen are very eroded. And I wonder if that's part of it too, that the Rohirrim just kind of stop paying a whole lot of attention because the features are not so clear.
Yeah, great answer, Erin. Very interesting. I feel like I have to go dive back into those texts again since I'm not super familiar with them. Alina, I see that you are here. I have a question for you as well from Alex. Two quick questions. What criteria must an individual meet to be defined as a Native American today in the US? And are they the same for all the states, or do they vary from state to state for different tribes? And then I feel like that's a logistic question, so I'm going to throw in a question from Nicholas as well about how do the people of the Shire show resilience, and does this remind you of the Anishinaabe resilience, similarities or differences?
Thank you so much, Claire. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Perfect. Yes, each reservation has their own criteria in order to be enrolled. You can be Native American or have Native American ancestry, or even if you do like one of those blood testing kits, you might show up as Native American, but to be enrolled, you do have to meet a specific criteria, which is blood quantum. In the US, Native Americans and dogs are the only groups to be counted by blood quantum. So kind of interesting there, right? It does vary between different reservations. And sometimes, like Reservation A won't count your ancestry from this tribe over here. They'll only count your ancestry from their specific tribe. So it does vary depending on each reservation. And yes, the hobbits, with the Battle of Bywater, and they have shown resilience and confidence. And what's really interesting too is that my grandfather helped found AIM, which was an activist group back in the day. So we can look to like our parents and our grandparents, their activism, and kind of see what we can take from that today in our struggle and in our fights. Things are better, but things are also different and worse in other ways, right? And we also see the resilience of the hobbits and how they restored their way of life as well. And not only helping Middle Earth in general, but reclaiming the Shire. And even if we look what happened after the Battle of Bywater, what happened after the War of the Ring, and how they were able to keep their place in the world.
Yeah, great answer, Alina. I love that. I'm going to ask a question from Pete, and I think this is open to everybody since everyone touched on this in different ways in their paper. So Pete asks, well, first has really interesting talks raising questions of how cultural identities in Middle-earth were created, removed, and merged, and the conflict that arose. Would anyone like to comment on the Bree land, a unique area where Bree men related to the Dunlendines and hobbits lived together in a single community with a good deal of common culture and identity, and maybe how that is similar or different to some of the ideas you have all been discussing, but open to the floor.
I mean, I can jump in if nobody else wants to.
Please jump in.
Yeah, so one of the things that I had hoped to include, and it kind of ended up not being in the text, so I wasn't going to get to it anyway, but one of the things I think is really fascinating is the Dunlendish language, which we're told is not related to the other languages of other groups of men in Middle-earth. And also, we're told that at a time when the vast majority of other peoples throughout the western parts of Middle-earth had all adopted Westron, The Dunlendings did not. They kept their own language, and they're one of very few groups, to do that. But the exception are the Dunlendings who left Dunland and moved up to Bree. And they did, kind of abandon their Dunlandish language and take up Westron. And it is interesting that we get the big people and the hobbits coexisting in Bree. To kind of tie into that, another point that I didn't get to was that looking at the Dunlendings through this lens of a people who were figuring out how to sort of survive and thrive and deal with marginalization, actually explains some things because, for example, at one point in the early part of the Third Age, we're told that some of the hobbits, the Stores, actually settle in Dunland for a little while. They actually pick up some Dunlandish language. And when they finally move up to the Shire, they take that with them. And there's some names that are apparently kind of weird in the Shire because it's this group of Stores. And I mention that just because thinking about Bree as this place of coexistence, I think it's interesting that it's actually not the only place or time when we get that kind of coexistence happening between the Dunlendings and a group like the Hobbits. There's also some evidence to suggest that there may have been a bit of a connection there between the Dunlendings and the dwarves too. And so I was toying with this idea that maybe the Dunlendings, as a somewhat marginalized people, ended up having kind of a connection to other peoples who were also kind of on the margins of these bigger, more powerful or more complex societies.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Erin. Alina, I was specifically thinking for your work how this might relate with how the hobbits are on one hand one community, but also a conglomeration of different communities in a way, and if that like affects how it plays out.
Yeah, 100%. I would say that's definitely correlated to Native American groups today. For example, a lot of my family is Métis, and they descend from French fur traders and Ojibwe Anishinaabe. So they've created a unique culture. I would say all Native Americans are mixed in some way. For example, most of my family is we call Findian, so Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Finnish immigrants make up our specific little ethnic group. So it's kind of a living in two worlds concept. There's always going to be some sort of mix of culture, especially in the United States. And yeah, that definitely correlates to the Shire and how different ethnic groups live together and kind of create a new cultural group as well.
Yeah, fascinating. James, for your paper, I was specifically thinking in The Fall of Arthur, since you talked a lot about you talked a little bit about a comparison between Lancelot and Mordred, and am always intrigued by Lancelot's nationality affecting how he is both in and out of that group. Which obviously goes into much broader, complicated issues of how the legends and stories were blended together. But that also seems to represent different communities, but also the same. It seems like it gets complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in terms of the fall of art, obviously, since we're talking about the body and the environment as well, there is that sense of distancing in terms of Lancelot. Obviously, he's exiled into France, so there's this very tense atmosphere in Canto 3 in the Fall of Arthur. Obviously, we have the turmoil of Lancelot having been banished, and he's within reach of his home, as in not his ancestral home, since he was technically from France, but having been exiled from his king, there's this very how shall I describe it? we get a really powerful sense in the few verses that we have available from the unfinished poem about this sense of distancing and being almost marginalized from your community ultimately, and I mean that really reflects in the character of Lancelot. And you mentioned Mordred as well. Despite him, as soon as Arthur and Gawain and the rest leave for their quest in Europe, and he takes over and usurps the throne, it's interesting how Tolkien plays on Mordred's character, and that he provides a depth to the villain ultimately in the poem, by making him isolated as well. And despite him being in his own homeland, he has never been so marginalized and so distant from the rest of the characters, despite him physically being there. So there's a very interesting dynamic happening there. So
Yeah, that is fascinating. I'm coming away from this just wanting to reread all the texts that you have mentioned. I think we have time for one more question, but I'm going to kind of combine two questions, and I think this one will also apply to everyone. So I'll open it up for everyone to speak. These questions are from Alan, so they're directed at Aaron, but I think given Alina's previous answer and what James has just talked about, you'll have some interesting things to say as well. So Aaron, I'll let you start, but can you expand a bit on intermarriage between the Dunlendings and Rohirrim and how that could be a strategy for survival? And I think related to that is how the blending of identities happens in the West March. And Alina, I'm sure you'll have stuff to say about this as well. But Aaron, I'll let you go first, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So yeah, we do get this really interesting phenomenon where the Dunlendings sort of come over the border and settle right around Isengard, and we're told that they intermarry. The way it's described is the blood became mixed, and the connotation seems to be kind of negative. But part of what I thought was really interesting here was that whenever that happens in the history of the Dunlendings, it seems that then this group, which now has this sort of mixed heritage, seems always to end up sympathizing with the Dunlendings, and becoming hostile to the Rohirrim. And that's kind of the dynamic that happens over and over again. So the mingling that we get here of bloodlines and families doesn't seem to result in the Dunlendings giving up their own culture, or adopting the culture of the Gondorians or the Rohirrim. Instead, it kind of goes the other way, which is interesting. And so I think while the strategy of the Dunlendings is to keep migrating into Rohan, even though they keep getting kicked out again, that might seem counterproductive. There are examples of studies of marginalized groups in our world where we can see that sometimes these groups do use strategies like intermarriage as a way to kind of reclaim like their rights or their dignity, their position in a society that has tried to exclude them. And I think maybe we could see this as the Dunlendings trying to kind of reclaim aspects of that physical landscape of the Westfold, and perhaps in a way that would be difficult for the Rohirrim to dislodge. So for example, in the West March, right, this area that's just right on the border, it's the furthest west piece of the territory of the Rohirrim, we hear that there is a lot of intermarrying going on, that the people there in that whole region are all of mixed blood. And we even have the example of the one leader we get there, Freka, the father of Wolf, the one who gets killed by one punch from Helm, who has just this very interesting blended identity, because he claims to be descended from one of the kings of Rohan. But we get told that there are rumors that he has Dunlending blood, and Helm calls him a Dunlending, but Freka never calls himself that. Right, so what's going on here in terms of that identity? I think it's interesting, the blending there. We also hear that later in the Third Age, one of the kings of Rohan comes in and drives the Dunlendings out of the West March. And when he does that, he discovers that the rest of the people left there are of mixed blood. And it's like, well, how did you tell?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel like there's so much work to be done there, not to give you 10 years worth of academic commitments, but it can be done. All of what you're saying really, Elena, makes me think of not only like what your paper and what you were talking about, but what you said in your questions about all the different mixed identities and heritages that a lot of different Native Americans have, and how that plays into like all of these different strategies for survival and just building community and all the relationships there.
Yeah, absolutely. Intermarriage would definitely assisted with survival, especially with the population decline with Native Americans. And it created several different ethnic groups too. Um, the Ojibwe sided with the British in Canada during colonial times, and a lot of those natives were actually sent to the current state of Louisiana. And they became known as Cajun. Then we have the Métis from the Ojibwe and the French traders. And actually, it's very common to have intermarriage between Native Americans and other ethnic groups, and it was actually encouraged by the government to dilute Native blood as well. But it's also created several different ethnic groups, which is definitely a positive thing in that sense, and has ensured our survival as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic answer. Your comment about the encouragement of like diluting the bloodline seems particularly relevant to how Tolkien handles some of his diminishing bloodlines. Very interesting. And then last but not least, James, I'm going to throw the question to you. I feel like not only in The Fall of Arthur and Outruin and Truin is there kind of like different competing identities and relationships, but also heavily those stories heavily rely on marriage relationships and how all those dynamics come to bear in a marriage or a marriage that's falling apart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the Fall of Arthur, for instance, his marriage to Arthur's marriage to Guinevere itself functions as a symbolic union of noble houses, a union that should secure the realm's harmony ultimately, but their estrangement and her betrayal with Lancelot exposes the fragility of this order, and the failure of this marriage, and by extension, the failure of legitimate inheritance reflects almost Tolkien's anxiety about the disintegration of rightful kingship. And the once pure heroic lineage has become entangled in human frailty, pride, and disloyalty ultimately. And in the Lay of Otro and the Throne, going back to the idea of and the question of lineage and fertility, here it's treated in a more intimate and moral plane. As we've seen, Atro's desperate attempt to secure an heir by magical means is a violation of natural and divine order. So Otro seeks to control this flow, this inheritance, to impose mastery over life itself almost. And obviously in doing so, he contaminates, for lack of better word, his lineage with deceit. And his death, and it runs shortly after that, marks the extinction of their house, and there's this sense of a divine rebalancing after Otro's overreach. So I would say across both works, Tolkien frames the mingling of bloodlines as a test of humility ultimately, which I think is one of the remarkable things about, especially about these lesser known works, so to speak.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel like what you're talking about really highlights a lot of what Alina and Aaron have said about like how Tolkien plays out his bloodlines, but how that's so heightened in like royal lines and things like that.
We'll start with questions directed at Hannah because Eric has lost service again. Okay, so the first one is from Pauline, and she's asking, is Arwen half elven? Surely the choice was made by Elrond, so both her parents are elves.
It's okay. I was eliding that and I see some correction in the chat as well. But I was kind of shortening for the sake of time. I will admit that I don't know. I'm not the person to answer about the like deep in-depth implications of Tolkien's cosmology, but Arwen isn't like half elf and half mortal. She's sort of a lineage of people who all have the choice of mortality and immortality. Elrond had it, his twin brother had it. Arwen's brothers who are twins also have it, presumably, but she's the one who makes the choice.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so the next question for you, Hannah, is from Mark. He says, this is outside the scope since its first stage, but could the fact that the sea longing is awakened in Tur indicate that although he is a man, he shares the destiny of the elves, at least according to the Elven and Númenórean lore?
Um, so Elven and Númenórean lore is not only outside of the scope of this talk, but also really outside of what I'm familiar with and what I feel like I can talk about. But I think that maybe what I can say to that is that that sort of question is one of those things I think this lens of inquiry opens up for us, and that it would be really interesting to explore in the future as like how does this how does this sort of, I guess, cosmological implication of the sea and the character's relationship to it impact those who don't technically or theoretically have the sense of belonging that some of the elves do?
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry for the rapid fire. So here's a next question from Liz. You touched on Legolas's context as unique. He's an interesting elven character due to an implied positioning between the Sindar and Sylvian, and the unique context of Mirkwood over time. Can you pull apart your thoughts a bit more on the role of that liminality and/or his unexplored heritage, on your ideas around sea longing in the third and fourth ages?
Why, thank you so much, Liz, for that completely spontaneous question. Liz and I have talked a lot about Legolas's heritage. Legolas is such a fascinating character in The Lord of the Rings because, to the best of my knowledge, Tolkien didn't write a lot about him. He's just kind of a guy in the Fellowship. But what we do get is really interesting, and this is another thing fans have really taken and run with in a way that I think a lot of scholarship hasn't. So we know that Legolas's father is Thranduil, who was of the like we know that he was from Doriath. I don't know that we know his background before that. But he was one of the elves who did not sail over the sea, and who eventually relocated, eliding a complicated political history to Erin Lascallon with many others from that time. Legolas's mother, there is nothing said, to the best of my understanding. A lot of fans have interpreted that as Legolas's father is Sindar and he is of those elves. But his mother is probably was already in the Greenwood when those elves came there. That has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. One way it has been interpreted is through sort of an indigenous lens, and implies that the elves who were already living in Mirkwood had much less of a desire to sail, had never even come close to the sea. And that therefore he probably has a more unique connection to his land as someone who personally has never relocated, but also who was born among people who have less of a connection to that sort of Valinor. I don't really know how to describe it, but that larger sort of somewhat hierarchical connection. Anyway, I'm not making a lot of sense, but I think Legolas is a fascinating character to read through that lens because you can argue that he is perhaps even more connected than a lot of the other elves who may have sailing in their plan in their 5,000 year plans, if you will. But Legolas presumably does not. And this is something that fans have really pulled out and given a lot more environmental like implication, depth, fleshing out than I've seen in Tolkien scholarship, and definitely more thought than Tolkien himself seems to have given the character.
Thank you.
And yes, I'm seeing some very important comments in the chat about how Legolas and Gimli get married and sail across the sea, and I agree with you. This is what happens. But one thing I will say that I didn't have time for in the paper, but some feedback that I got when I was workshopping it would be to think about what the implications of the sort of connection to land and disability connection are with Gimli and the fact that he does eventually sail with Legolas, because it is both like Legolas gets to take a piece of home with him, and also that Gimli is now the person who's displaced. But it is also interesting because presumably that happens around the time of Gimli's impending death. So there's like very interesting, more like complicated disability theory perspective that you could tease out in that I did not have time to, but as someone who always wants to talk about Legolas and Gimli, I would love to someday.
Thank you. That's such a wonderful answer. I realize you're a bit on the hot seat right now. And so are you down for two more questions that are kind of leaning towards fan theory, fandom, and disability? Okay, so we'll go
Yeah, I
through.
was a little anxious when I realized I was the only one who was going to be here for Q&A, but it's
Well,
fine.
you're doing wonderfully. So if you're happy for it, we can, okay, we'll ask you two more questions, but you're doing wonderfully. So this is from Bree. Hannah, in your work in fandom studies, have you noticed an overlap between queer readings and disability readings? I've noticed that many fics that focus on disability in the Legendarium often have queer subplots.
This is such a good question. And this is some of the things that I'm actually really interested in and hoping to tease out through my personal studies, which I've only just started, so I don't know what that'll look like yet, but I think absolutely. There's an interesting thread of scholarship in fan studies that I haven't followed, that I haven't pursued as far as I'd like to, but that I would really like to, that discusses the ways that vulnerability and illness, injury, and pain, and to some extent disability, are used to further intimacy between different characters. And there's been some like, there's the typical combination of both celebration and critique of that idea, because some people, uh, there's a sort of pushback that then renders disability more of a plot device to further a queer subplot. Um, I think it's, as so many things, it's more complicated than that, especially because a lot of the people doing this work are both queer and disabled or are exploring the combination of those two things. But it's a very interesting thread. I think that they are definitely connected. I think that there are a lot of queer themes to be read. And I think that one thing that's important too is that there is this idea that comes along with a lot of readings in both disability studies and queer studies, that is this idea of deviance, of there's an expected norm that isn't really a norm, but it's been created, that people and in fiction characters are expected to conform to. And in fiction, deviation from that norm can be read both as disabling and as queering. And so I think that there's a lot of overlap. So in fan fiction specifically, there's this question of like disability and intimacy, but then in queer critique and disability studies more generally, there's also this question of reading deviance in work, or reading diverging from an expected norm in both ways, and possibly both simultaneously.
Thank you. So finally, similar threads, but another from Liz. She's apologizing for writing it quickly, but okay, so as someone who has also stepped into the space created by Legolas's sea longing and Frodo's trauma in fanfic, as you know, I'm curious if you can talk about the tension explored between staying and going in those sorts of fan works, and any thoughts you have on how fans are consciously or subconsciously engaging with disability in their work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Um, because, and I kind of mentioned this briefly, but in a lot of the fan works that I have read, um, it's not so much the there's sort of two different threads, at least for Legolas, and I haven't read as much about Frodo. But at least for Legolas, there's this sort of the thread that is the sea longing is a disabling force in that it affects the mind, basically. That like that some people will write this, again, as I said, some people will write this as a an analogy basically to depression or to mental illness where you're sad. I mean, there's a lot more complexity to it, but like that it is sort of an emotional impact. And that is the source, the source is the sea. And others argue this is kind of the same thing, but kind of I think there's a little bit of a difference in how it's written, is that it's not the sea longing that is the source of the pain, it's the choice not to sail over the sea. It's the choice to stay. And that tension can be explored in a lot of different ways. And I think this is another one of those places where it really converges with queer readings, particularly in fan fiction, because for a lot of people, a lot of the tension and the reason that Legolas chooses to stay is not just because he loves Middle Earth, but because he loves his friends and the people who can't sail over sea with him. And you know, some might argue that he loves Gimli and marries him. And anyway, I don't have a bias, I promise. But it is a way of reading that is that becomes the sort of the impetus to stay is stronger, but the desire to go imposes intense emotional pain, I guess. And I think that that is a tension that fans are really playing with in different ways and in different sort of nuances, but it's it's fun to read. I highly recommend it if you're interested in any of this. Just go look up Legolas Sea Longing fan fiction. Anyway, I don't know if that fully answered the question, but it was fun to think about.